Hello, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the Reva and David Logan Symposium on the Artist Book. I'm Steve Woodall, collection specialist for artist books at the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, where I work with the Reva and David Logan collection of illustrated books. The Logan's 1998 gift to the museum has made the Fine Arts Museums one of the country's prime locations for the study and display of the artist's book. And let me begin to move my slides, and I'm having a technical problem here with the slides. Here we go. Okay, very good. Reva and David Logan. This year's symposium and so much more is jointly funded by the foundations of two of Reva and David Logan's sons, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation and Daniel Logan's Barbata Foundation. First, though, I'd like to briefly review yesterday's program for any of you who are tuning in today who might have missed yesterday's program. First, our keynote speaker, Dana Gioia's keynote talk it was a compelling memoir, a story of poet-printer collaborations, a bridge from the written poem to the printed page, and a tracing of the arc of an important poet's career and his relationships with the printers and publishers of his work. Philip Zimmerman's talk Phil's talk showed us how in the hands of a master, word and text can play off of one another to create effect, combining to make something greater than the sum of their parts. In this case, bridging a 19th century text with 21st century imaging, enhanced and designed by an artist. Andre Bradley's talk was also a kind of memoir, a powerful, moving, and very personal memoir of self-definition. Coming of age as a young Black man in the inner city. It was a striking juxtaposition of text and images. In Nigel Poor's talk, she brings us inside the environment of a prison to find talented collaborators to present an epic collection of stories from a place and time normally hidden from us under lock and key. These presenters will be joining us at the end of today's program for Q&A and discussion, but meanwhile, yesterday's entire program can be found now even on YouTube. YouTube search bar, you can Google Bridges Social Engagement and you'll find it, as well as this program as soon as we're finished today. So it's been, before I introduce Cliff Meadow, I want to just say that it's been an incredible privilege for me to be able to present these symposiums over the past 6 years. And this weekend's event is very personally important to me. It has brought together some of the most remarkable stories I've been privy to in my 30-year career in the world of book arts and artist books. I'm very lucky to have been able to share the work of our presenters with you. And I hope you're going to find the stories today as inspiring as I have. Today's presenters have engaged with communities and territories we think of as exotic. They have brought back stories from cultures very different from ours. But these stories usually seem to turn out to be stories that are in some way universal, that reveal our common humanity. The bridge in both cases is the book, and the engagement can be what Laura Anderson Barbata beautifully and succinctly calls a reciprocal exchange of knowledge. There is a mutually intense curiosity that seeks common ground. Clifton Meadow's talk will reveal his exploration of the outer limits of that experience, seeking common ground and understanding. Clifton Meadow was a colleague when I was director of Center for Book and Paper Arts at Columbia College, Chicago. Cliff was director of the MFA program that we supported. More recently, he served as chair of the Department of Art at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina for 5 years, and that is now professor in the graphic design and graphic communications management programs there. And like Nigel Poor yesterday, Cliff comes perilously close to refuting what I said yesterday when I called the phrase famous book artist an oxymoron. He's traveled to more places in the world than anybody I know, and inevitably he returns with material for at least one, if not several, impressive artist books that deconstruct a place, its people, and its history in ways that bring you some kind of real understanding of a subject you may not have previously known even existed. His work has rightfully gained him many honors, and I'm proud to call Cliff a friend. One of his best known books begins really literally with a bridge, which you may recognize as the Raymond Pettis Bridge. It is a work from 1995 that looks back at the deep historic context for the famous March of 1965, a book that's even more relevant today than when it was published. Cliff's work is all about creating bridges to a better understanding of history, as in Long, Slow March, and bridges to understanding a culture, as in the work he's about to discuss with us today. Very pleased to present Clifton Meadow.
Thanks, Steve. That was an incredibly generous introduction. I have to say that this group of people that I'm presenting with is really impressive. I love the work I've seen so far. It makes me think about what a broad area of activity people who make books are engaged in. And so I want to talk about another group of people who make books. And it's not a place I think most people have heard of, but it's a place where printing books is a devotional activity. So the activity of printing itself has some special significance for the people who do it. And the books that get printed there are an important part of some people's identity. And then I'd like to show some of my own work that was created in response to my experience there. I hope you'll hang with me there for a little history at first, try to create a sense of the context for this place. The place I want to talk about is a printing temple located on the border between Sichuan in China and the Tibetan Autonomous Republic. This place is called the Durga Parkang, and Parkang in Tibetan means a printing temple or a place where printing happens. The Durga Parkang is a Sutra printing temple, and it's a vibrant living institution that prints books from hand-carved wooden blocks. And as an artist who includes printing as a central part of what I do, learning about this institution blew my mind. I was lucky enough to be invited to be part of an interdisciplinary research team that documented, interviewed workers there and the people around the area, and recorded the products of the Durga Parkang. Dr. Patrick Dowdy and Dr. Padma Tso were really the principal investigators in this project, and I was just grateful to be part of the team. So the Durga Parkang is located very close to the Drichu River, which is one of the sources of the Yangtze River, and located up high in the mountains. Durga itself is a slightly lower place. It's located at about 10,000 feet, but you go over these amazing mountain passes to get there. For centuries, and here comes the history, Durga was an independent kingdom that became famous for scholars, monasteries, and artists. And it was one of the few stable political entities in that eastern part of the historically Tibetan region between Sichuan in China and what we think of as Tibet now. The kings of Durga emerged in the 17th century as important players in Tibetan politics, notable for supporting all the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism, an early form of ecumenicalism, as well as being patrons of 5 great monasteries in their kingdom. But in the subject of this talk, for their establishment and support of a great Tibetan printing temple, the Durga Parkang. Here's a picture of Durga in 2007. I have not been back to Durga since then. I actually have no idea what's going on there now, but this is the way the town looked then. And you can see there's a modern part to the town, and then back up into the valley, you can see a more traditional Tibetan town. The kingdom of Durga's emergence as a strong regional power really was thanks to the vision of the 40th king of Durga, the Dharmaraja Tenpa Tsering, who lived 1678 to 1738 Common Era, but was king of Durga 1714 to 38. So as the ruler of an independent kingdom sandwiched between these two political powers with imperial ambitions, the Chinese Empire and the Tibetan polity, Tenpa Tsering was able to play Lhasa and Beijing off against each other, receiving and lending military and even economic aid from both, but never ceding his political authority. And here's walking up from the modern part of the town towards the more traditional part, and that's the Durga Parkang at the top of the street there. And the Durga Parkang is Tenpa Tsering's longest lasting achievement, one that created an institution that continues to this day to be an important publishing endeavor. Tenpa Tsering started this project by inviting and commissioning editors, most notably the 8th Situ Panchen, to produce an authoritative edition of the Kanjur and the Tanjur, which are the words of Buddha and collected commentaries in Tibetan. He then gathered scholars, writers, editors, proofreaders, block cutters, bindery workers, paper and ink makers, distributors, as well as builders to build a huge building to house all this activity. This is an enormous undertaking and really demonstrates Tenpa Tsering's ability to organize and create institutions that have had a long tail. The first product of the Durga Parkang were the 6 copies of this Durga edition of the Buddhist canon printed from these wooden blocks. And subsequent copies were printed and distributed to other monasteries and families in Tibet, Mongolia. This authoritative edition, the Durga Kanjur and Tanjur, spread the fame of the kingdom of Durga as a center of learning excellence and proof of really long-lasting evidence of the Tibetan people's beliefs and practice embodied in a publishing program. This is the front of the Parkang right in 2007. It looks like this still, as far as I can tell. The survival of the Parkang through so much difficult history signifies more to most Tibetans than simply the persistence of a great printing house. The Durga Parkang is the physical repository for more than 300,000 wooden printing blocks, some dating back to the early part of the 18th century, and so has become a literal embodiment of religious and cultural history, really an amazing record of Tibetan culture. The range of books preserved at the Parkang is broad. Not only are there works from all the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but also works of history, works of medicine, and even works of music. The fact of the survival of this important record, when so many other institutions have not survived, makes the Parkang a place with an important connection to the history of Tibetan culture. The construction for this building started in the 18th century, 1740s, and parts of it date to there, but it's been continuously modified since then and expanded over the years. It's really hard to overstate the importance of the Durga Parkang to Tibetan identity. I observed people coming from all over the Tibetan-speaking world to perform kora, which is a circumambulation around a sacred site or object, usually part of a pilgrimage or a ritual of some kind. Here are some people performing kora with full body prostrations. So they walk all the way around the Parkang, but measuring out the circuit with the lengths of their bodies, which is an amazing act of homage, really. And so these pilgrims, monks, and tourists travel huge distances to visit the Parkang, partially motivated by a desire to experience this real link to the history, and also to honor the survival of this cultural monument. It's really a miracle it survived. The biggest part of the Parkang, the middle section of the Parkang building, is a huge dark area. The building has no electricity and only natural light is allowed inside the building. It's where the blocks are stored. And down at the bottom of this screen is a page from that first edition of the Durga Kanjur, the authoritative edition. And all of the pages in that edition have little illustrations, little pictures of various emanations of the Buddha. So it's a storehouse for printing blocks for a vast corpus of Tibetan literature. The Parkang provides physical evidence of cultural continuity. Simply walking through the block storage areas of the Parkang is a direct experience with the magnitude of the intellectual and artistic effort in this literature. As I said, the interior of the Parkang is unilluminated except by a few open windows. So the experience is one of walking through seemingly endless dark passages, filled floor to ceiling with printing blocks. Thousands and thousands of carved wooden blocks, aisle after aisle, presented an overwhelming sight to me. It's dark in there, quiet, and it smells of incense, butter, wood, and age. And so while I was standing there, it was hard not to think of all the people whose lives were spent in this vast labor. Monks and laymen, writers and printers, workers and pilgrims. And I imagine that they're all co-authors of this cultural monument, and their beliefs, ideas, and values live on in the literature that's still produced there, a literature that continues to grow and to be in demand. Some of the blocks carved in the 19th century are still being printed today, but the oldest blocks are now considered cultural relics and are not printed anymore. But they're still present in the Parkong, and these are some of them right here, sitting quietly on shelves, evidence of the long history of publishing here. It's important, though, for me to make the point that it's not a museum only dedicated to the preservation of obsolete technology. It's a living, vibrant institution that continues to translate and publish new texts, works that have never previously been published in Tibetan. These new works are published in nearly the same manner that books have been made at the Parkong since the 1740s, with some minor alterations in the process. The revival of this traditional process of book production during the early 1980s, after a 20+ year hiatus when the building was sealed up, is an important part of preserving the Parkong's importance as a cultural and religious institution. The Parkong still employs editors who select manuscripts to publish, translate them into Tibetan, and word process those texts. Here's a calligrapher transcribing from a laser printed manuscript at the top of the screen onto paper using the highly evolved Durga calligraphy style. So this calligrapher will transcribe that text on this thin piece of paper. And then the thin piece of paper is pasted onto a prepared wooden block, wrong reading. And highly skilled block cutters who spend years in apprenticeship cut out the letters, and then they'll proof the blocks. And then another group of highly skilled workers will perform any corrections needed. So when they do a correction, they just drill out the character that's wrong, glue in a plug of wood, and carve a new character. That was endlessly fascinating to me. After the blocks have been seasoned, which means they're soaked in a kind of butter water solution and then allowed to dry in the sun for a while, they're sent to the Parkong to be printed. The editions run. Most of the editions that we saw were printed on decent quality machine-made uncoated paper. Now, it's true at the Durga Parkong, they've revived the traditional Tibetan paper-making processes, but they don't make nearly enough paper by hand to supply the number of books people want. They do small editions, sometimes on handmade paper, but mostly they use this machine-made paper. So here the printers are dampening the paper, and it's allowed to sit and even out its moisture overnight for the next day's work. And this is the printing loft inside the Parkong where the printers work. There's an open light well there. There are no windows, it's just open spaces. And the printers only work when it's warm enough to print. So for several months of the year, the Parkong is closed. The printers work in pairs, one person inking and one person rolling the sheet of paper into contact with the block. And here's a stack of the blocks ready to be printed. That's about a day's work, maybe. And this is a printing stand. So one worker sits on the left on that cushion and gets ink out of that tray. It's all water-based ink, and they make the red ink there by grinding some mineral. And the person on the right-hand seat grabs the paper, flips it onto the block, and then rolls it into contact. So here's the inker getting ready to ink the block as he's simultaneously putting the block into the brace, while the other worker is grabbing a sheet of paper and flipping it onto the block and then rolling it. They work really fast. They print 1,500 double-sided sheets in a day. And so they establish a kind of hypnotic rhythm while they're working. The workers there, I think, see their work simultaneously as a kind of work. They get paid to do it, but also as something meritorious, that their practice has some other significance for them that is religious, but also part of a cultural observation. At the end of the day, the damp printed sheets are gathered and hung on lines to dry overnight. Next morning, another set of workers comes along, pulls the dried sheets off, curates them, and then collects them into the books in the right order, and then sews one thread through a corner to keep it together as a book block. These bundled books are then tied off with red twine. It's actually plastic. And then taken down into the bindery, which was a dark room in the very bottom part of the Parkong, where the edges are first trimmed off with something that looks like a giant sword. and then the edges, and then they grind the edges down with a cheese grater, and you can see it in the very right-hand edge of this picture. And then they paint the edges red, and that's all the binding they do. The books are then separated out of the standing press and sent to the bookstore to be sold. Every day at the Durga Parkang, we observed local people, pilgrims, tourists, and workers walking around the Parkang performing kora, and we did it ourselves every day. Here in the foreground, you can see two people spinning prayer wheels, and I imagine that most of you know what these are, but each prayer wheel contains a mantra, which is a little piece of scripture. Usually, Om Mani Padme Om would be a typical one. And the act of spinning the prayer wheel accumulates wisdom and merit and purifies negativities. And in some way, spinning the wheel replaces chanting or reading. And I think performing kora has some similar activity. So I imagine that people walking around the Parkang were performing a kind of reading, a kind of participation in the corpus of literature stored inside the building, and that the people thus honoring the Parkang were becoming part of the literature preserved in the Parkang. So I wanted to make a book to honor this, the people's reverence for the Parkang, and I titled the book Kora, which is the activity of walking around the building. And the form of kora is derived from a traditional Tibetan style book. The book cloth from kora, which is the way these books are usually stored, wrapped up in a piece of cloth so they don't come apart, comes from Durga, and it's one of the traditional ways to store a book. The pages in kora and most traditional Tibetan books are loose, and the long page shape is in itself a reference to palm leaf sutra from India, which is probably the way Buddhism spread into Tibet, was palm leaf manuscripts carried up into the mountains. And then there's now an association with this long, narrow book form that is sutra. Tibetan books are traditionally, at least, come in 5 sizes, with the largest size reserved to the Kanjur and the Dinjur, the books of scripture and the commentary. The book I made, though, has a short text, and it's in one of the smaller sizes, and pictures of people performing kora. I stood in one spot outside the Parkang and photographed people as they passed the same spot in the wall. And I tried to only use photographs of people where you couldn't see their faces, except, of course, for the tourists who are going the wrong way. It's important to walk clockwise around the Parkang. The glyphs, the little line drawings accompanying the text, are drawings of the pilgrims that I turned into a digital font, thinking of this as a kind of metaphoric activity to literally embody the people I saw performing, kora into the means of literature. So with this digital font, when you type, you get people and not words. The text that I wrote in this book was an exhortation to myself as much as anything else, thinking about the relationship of the people, the pilgrims, the workers, the monks, the tourists, and the Parkang itself, and the importance of the Parkang to all these people. The second book I wanted to show you is called 3 Tibetan Bookstores, and it's also uses the font that I had created for kora. One of the things we did as part of this research project was to try to investigate the use context for Tibetan books. Where do they get used? How do they get stored? And so we went to as many Tibetan bookstores as were close to the places we were traveling and photographed these bookstores. I experienced a strong sense of being illiterate over and over in these bookstores. I knew the bookstores were full of really interesting books, but I tried to learn how to read Tibetan briefly, and it was impossible for me. So I wrote a little story about this sense of being illiterate in the face of all this literature. And I typeset it in kora so that the people who honor the literature of the Parkang are now embodied as a story of my failure to be able to read this. The other part of this book is 2 long panoramas of images of the bookstores we photographed, 2 of the bookstores. And the books that are in these bookstores are clearly interesting, filled with things I couldn't know, inaccessible to me. This is the bookstore at the Parkang, near the Parkang. It's not actually in the Parkang, it's across the plaza. But you can get a sense of how Tibetan books are stored. They're stored long ways in bookshelves. The title is usually written on a slip of paper and stuck in the short end of the book. And these shelves were filled with interesting books, and I didn't even know how to ask for which ones I wanted to read or look at, because they're full of illustrations as well. This was a different kind of bookstore, a bookstore located in Chengdu, which is in Sichuan, which is a big province of China located on the border with the Tibetan Autonomous Republic. And these books are all printed by offset lithography. And some of them contain calligraphy done by hand, but many of them are digitally typeset in Tibetan characters. It's a kind of a hint to the possible contents of these inaccessible books. I'd been reading about Tibetan Buddhism, and I made a list of the mnemonic tools people use that Tibetans use to talk about the metaphysics in Tibetan Buddhism. So this little thing in the back of this book is partially enumerating Tibetan Buddhism, and I made a list of all the mnemonic cues that people use to remember very complicated ideas. And so I arranged them numerically. Finally, the last book I want to share with you was the last book I made from this experience. And it, I think, sort of closed my thinking about it for a while, though I've been thinking about it since preparing this talk. In this book, Heart uses the text from the Heart Sutra mantra, which is Gate, Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Bodhisvaha, which translated might be something like gone, gone, everyone gone to the other shore, awakening, Svaha. The word Svaha apparently is difficult to translate, not that I would know, but I've seen it translated sometimes as wow, and that's the translation I would prefer, is wow. And the Heart Sutra mantra exhorts the reader to transcend, to go beyond appearances. And I used it as a point of departure to explore how representation and my own wrestling with this experience can direct and subvert a narrative. Sutra often start with the phrase, "Thus I have heard." And as I reflect on my experience in this project, the idea of Tibet haunted me. The lure of the exotic, the narratives of Orientalism, the word Tibet summons a host of things that really have nothing to do with Tibet. And I was trying to express this somehow in a narrative. So as the Heart Sutra mantra asks you to look past appearances, so I designed and printed a book that thwarts representation as much as possible. As part of this project, in 2007, we traveled to some of the remote monasteries near Durga in Ganza Prefecture. And Ganza is a smaller subunit of Sichuan right at the border there. This is one of the monasteries supported by the kings of Durga and the home of the Situ Panchen, who was the first editor of the Durga Tantra. So we went there to document the book printing house there. There's a parkang that survived at this monastery, though it's nothing like the size and scope of the Durga Parkang, but still an interesting and important place. This building, which is the oldest and maybe largest anyway, traditional Tibetan structure after the Potala, is situated on this knob, an amazing place. The narrative I wrote starts out by occupying a very traditional formal relationship with the image, at least at first, and it's metafictional and tries to directly address the reader and their expectations about a supposedly exotic experience. So let me read you a little bit from this spread. It took quite a while to travel 35 kilometers up that gorge to our destination. We saw it once before we got there, a flash of red through the end of the gorge, and we stopped to take pictures. Yes, that's it up there on the left-hand page. The other consequence of having seen something first as a picture is that any picture you make of it always seems lifeless, like a copy of a copy. It's hard for reality to work against illusion. While we were there, we learned that the brother of the artist who had drawn many of the excellent woodblock tanka still printed at the Durga Parkang was alive and living in Babum. He was ancient, a very old man, and living in a tiny room completely covered in beautiful tanka. We managed to get all 5 of us into the room and tried to interview him. It was a frustrating experience for me, since he mostly wanted to chant for us and perform blessings, and my mind drifted off to other things. One of the ongoing challenges for me and other artists who print their own work is to communicate how the participation of the artist in the production process is a creative part of the work. In this case, I wanted the 4-color printing to take a central role in the narrative, to be a main part of the way the book creates a persuasive experience. Since my goal was to deny the convention of the page as a window into another world, disrupting the image through printing seemed like a strong strategy. Heart uses intentional misregister of 4-color images is a strategy to disrupt the illusion of the picture as a window on the page and to try to slightly thwart the lure of the exotic. But that's impossible, of course. There's only one spot in each image that registers. The rendition of the world into cyan, magenta, yellow, and black is a fraught illusion for me, a lie that seems transparent to most of us. But that process of representing the world in these four colors is really just as mannered and full of transformation of reality as a dry point intaglio print. And as this work progresses, the normative relationship of caption and image breaks down. The images lose their defining edges, becoming even less of a window in the page, and the typography becomes increasingly performative. The narrative supports this disruption by further addressing the reader directly and telling the story of interviewing this monk without ever admitting he's a monk or using the word Tibet. Finally, I confess to the reader that my failure to transcend phenomenal experience, something I was hoping for, to create something that follows the exhortation of the Heart Sutra to go beyond, is my failure as a maker. This book is absolutely a thingly thing and not at all transcendental. And that my longing for real experiences, for things that seem beyond the simulacrum of mediated life, is a really hopeless yearning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cliff. Lauda, Anderson Barbata, is a transdisciplinary artist with studios in New York City and Mexico City. She produces work that, in her words, is, quote, intended to connect various cultures by engaging creative practices that promote dignity, shared values, diversity, and collaboration through, and I think this is the key phrase, reciprocal exchange of knowledge. Her work with the Yanomami of southern Venezuela led to the production of handmade paper and an award-winning book that preserves the belief systems of their culture. The project became a tool for advocacy, social justice, self-determination, and environmental protection. Like Clifton Meadow, I know of Lauda through my time at Columbia College, Chicago, where she was invited as a visiting artist by faculty member Melissa Potter, who curated an exhibition of Lauda's work. Lauda's stories of her first visits to the Amazon rainforest, accounts of the relationships she built with the indigenous people there, which you're about to hear and see, were to me at the time astonishing and remain astonishing. In her exhibition, we were able to display something almost unimaginable, artist books created by indigenous people deep in the rainforest of southern Venezuela, printed on paper made from native plants. And I hope Mel Potter is watching, because I want to thank her for making these connections to a very important artist and a very important project. I am so proud to be able to introduce you to a very courageous and very original artist, Lauda Anderson Barbata.
Hola, buenas tardes, good afternoon. Thank you, Steve, for that really beautiful introduction. My name is Lauda Anderson Barbata. As you said, I am a Mexican transdisciplinary artist, and I divide my time between New York and Mexico, and wherever my work takes me, as you will see in this talk. But first, I would like to thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me to participate in the Reva and David Logan Symposium. Yesterday's participants and speakers were so inspiring, are inspiring, and I look forward to sharing that recorded session. All their talks with my collaborators, specifically Sheronawe Hakihiwe, who you know. It really was incredible to listen to Andre Bradley, to Nigel Poor, to Dana Joya, and to Philip Zimmerman, whose work is all so different and so powerful. And yet all of them talk to us about community and the importance of building and sustaining community. And my work is about that as well. So it is an honor for me to be with you here tonight. Gracias. Since 1992, I have developed sustainable art-centered projects that integrate collaborative and participatory work to address social justice and the environment. The environment has been a continual concern and interest of mine since the beginning of my career. I had lived and studied in Rio de Janeiro in the 80s, and returning to Mexico, began my practice making works in the studio that addressed nature and the environment through drawings and sculpture. I sprouted seeds in my studio and drew them obsessively. As they germinated, I just watched them day and night. Seeds in germination offer to me the perfect metaphor. A seed can remain dormant for extended periods of time until one day, placed in the right conditions of light, moisture, and temperature, warmth, that seed that had been remained unchanged for so long begins to sprout and begins a transformation that never ends. In my drawings, I was searching for a way to communicate visually what happens when our interior self awakens and begins to transform and grow, and to map that. One of these drawings received an award during an exhibition called, some of you may know this, titled Eco Art 1992, at the Museo de Arte Moderno in Rio de Janeiro. This drawing is not it. This one is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But I want to talk about 1992. It was the same year that the Earth Summit was convened by the United Nations, and it was a hopeful and inspiring moment as the conference yielded Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which was adopted by 178 governments. A document that for the first time in history laid the groundwork for environmental protection safeguards for the 21st century. Now, this award took me to the Amazon of Venezuela for the first time. It was part of the award to go to Venezuela. And here I am showing you a map of Venezuela, and I worked in the lower part. I don't know if you can see my arrow, probably not. Anyway, the lower darker blue part, which is the border with Brazil, is where I worked. And this is the Yanomami territory. And right next to the Yanomami territory is the Yacuana territory as well. On this first trip to the Amazon of Venezuela, I carried with me a handmade notebook made with handmade paper and lots of different kinds of pencils. On my arrival into Majecoto, and you can see it here, an air view of the Majecoto, as I waited under the shade for the Yanomami community leaders and mission to approve my entrance into the community, I was greeted by a group of children. I did not know how to speak Yanomami, and the children did not speak Spanish. And I thought, no problem. We will speak in the language of art through drawings. So I started to hand them out pieces. I pulled out pieces of paper, sheets of paper from my notebook, and they were very interested in it, in that notebook. I could tell that they had not seen handmade paper. And I handed them each pencils and put them out for everyone. And naively, I was the only one who drew on my paper. One of the children held the paper up to the light and smelled it. One of the other children inspected it so closely and then pointed to a palm tree at a distance. Another made a small, tiny hole on one end and threaded a reed onto it and then ran with it and used it like a kite to watch the movement in the wind. Another one smoothed it out on the ground, really feeling the texture of the paper. As I saw how each one interacted with the paper, I realized I was in the presence of natural gifted paper makers. And this realization was like one of those seeds which was planted in my heart and began to germinate. On that same trip, I met the Ortiz family, who are Yacuana, and were teaching the Yanomami people in the community of Majecoto how to build canoes. Yacuana means the people of the canoe. And they are extraordinary canoe builders and navigators. And I wanted to learn from them how to build a canoe. It is a collaborative, participatory project where an endeavor where everyone has a very important role. So I asked them if they could teach me and if they would accept me as an apprentice. Their response made a deep impact in my life and my work as an artist. They asked, if we teach you how to build a canoe, what can you teach us in exchange? I understood immediately the importance of reciprocity, and it became the basis of all of my work, to value each other's experience and experience, exercise, respect through the horizontal exchange of knowledge. This is one of the canoes I worked on, the first one. I must say now, because the question will come up, I never really became very good at it. But let's go on talking about what was happening in this project. So the question is asked and posed, presented to me. What can you teach us in exchange? And I thought, as a Mexican, born and raised in Mexico, we have always been acutely aware of the narration of our history and the inaccuracy of it because it served the interests of colonizers. Inspired by the children in the community who I had just had that exchange and observed them, how they related to the paper, I proposed a bookmaking project and a project that combines environmental protection and the preservation and transcription of oral history in the communities through bookmaking with local materials to counter and be in dialogue with numerous publications written about their culture by scholars who were not part of the community. The Yacuana community discussed my proposal and accepted it. The bookmaking proposal was also embraced by the Yanomami community. And I also want to mention that I worked with Piaroa indigenous people of Venezuela as well. And each community took ownership of the project and directed the objectives, goals, and scope of the project. In this talk, I will focus on the Yanomami Owe Mamotima project. The communities have been taught to read and write by the missions, but not how to make their own books or document their own culture and history. Here we can see one of the schools. They are bilingual schools. They are learning Espanol and Yanomami. And here you can see, it's a very blurry slide, but you can see some of the blocks used to teach how to read and write in both languages. I felt that we could make fine quality paper and books by translating local technology used by the community to process roots and seeds for food, as well as the use of fibers that are traditionally harvested by the community to create many of their tools and goods such as arrows, hammocks, etc. So first, it was important to research in collaboration with the community the different ways in which they process and produce food and goods. So I'm going to show you some images from that. So here we see shiki. It is a fiber that is used, it's like a pineapple, and the fibers are used to make the strings that tie the top part of arrows. They are also used at the top of baskets. Now here, if any of you are paper makers, and many of you are, you can see how this was also very familiar. They're making the bread, cassave bread, and it is a hot plate onto which the cassave is being sifted onto. And so the technique for making paper was very easily understood because of this natural way of working, and the surface, the hot surface, often helped us in the high humidity for drying paper. This is the inside of a chapono with the traditional belongings and the configuration of the hammocks. So chapono means communal dwelling, and all of the families in the community live next to each other. And what differentiates each family is this placement of the hammocks. And in the center of the hammocks, which are also in a circle, there's a fire. So each grouping, each family has also a fire in the center, a small fire going inside a large circular construction. Now here is the way Yeguana people also dry some of the cassave bread, which also worked for us. And we studied some of the pigments and some of the leaves and techniques that were used for decorating gourds and baskets, textiles, things like that. But I have to confess that I did not know how to make paper in conditions such as these, where there is no running water, no electricity or equipment for paper making, and only to make paper with 100% natural local fibers. And here is the first sheet of paper, if you can call it paper, that we made, and I was so proud of it. But as you can see, it really it looks more like a tortilla, actually a poorly made tortilla than paper, and impossible to print on something like this, of course, or to write on it. And so we held community meetings and agreed that when I returned to New York, I would seek experts to guide us. And I took this sample along with all of my notes to Dieudonné Paper Mill in New York, and Mina Takahashi immediately recognized the potential and challenges the project had. And for many years, generously educated me, gave us recommendations to implement in the Amazon. We tested Amazon fibers in their controlled studio environment, and I would come back to the community with the results. Through many years, we compiled a fiber log, an extensive record of the use of tropical fibers for handmade paper making. And only 3 are in existence. One was donated to Dieudonné, the other to the Centro Nacional de IDEA in Caracas, and the third to the Instituto Nacional de Parques in the Amazon state of Venezuela, which is the national parks, who also were gave us permits, or gave me permits to allowed me to work in the area. The project leaders promoted the project in neighboring communities as we evolved and became better at making paper. And we began testing fibers and translating the locally used technology to create fine quality paper and notebooks without the use of electricity or materials from the outside of the community. We also began testing those fibers like the one I showed earlier and others. And we created workshops for the community also to teach their peers. And this is very important image for me because it shows Javier, who is still active in the project, who is a very, very skilled printmaker. And I would just share that knowledge and immediately whoever was there would share it with their peers. And this way also gaining more, becoming owners of the knowledge themselves. But also I want to mention that for the Yanomami, painting and decorating is part of everyday life. However, in the Yanomami tradition, it is more of a free form used with sticks and very organic lines. And the Yakwana, who are traditionally had a very good relationship with the Yanomami. As you saw earlier, they were teaching the Yanomami how to build canoes. The Yakwana have a different way of decorating their bodies, and they take a small piece of wood, carve it, and ink it and put it on their bodies. So for the Yanomami, it was also very familiar to see the block printing techniques and to translate into the bookmaking process was also quite simple because it was very familiar to them. And also I want to mention here, as I said, the relationship to art making and drawing and expression is everyday life in the Yanomami territory. And this image is one I like very much because I remember this day very well. And from that day, we started to change a lot of the things that we did. For example, one was we had to prepare double the amount of ink because everyone who came to the studio to observe, to contribute, to ask questions, to learn, participate, however, seeing the ink, they would paint their bodies first before beginning to work with us. So I realized that this is something we had to do. And here we see Koromoto and Eunice showing us a handmade book with the natural fibers made there. The spine of the arrow is used as, a broken arrow, discarded arrows serve as spines for the books that they were making. And here you see one of the traditional drawings that are Yanomami. During this time, the Yanomami were building a new shapono, and you can see it here as it's starting to come together. Their traditional communal circular dwelling, and the community felt it was the appropriate subject for their first book. A few years later, we finished the book Shapono, a handmade book with local fibers and illustrated by women, men, and children from the community. Shapono recounts the history of how the Yanomami were taught to build their traditional communal home and continue to build their home in the same manner today. The book received the award of the best book of the year by the Centro Nacional del Libro in Venezuela, and by recommendation of Clayton Kirking, who was chief librarian of art books at the New York Public Library, he recommended that we create a limited edition of 50 numbered and signed copies of the book, many of which are now part of major collections, including the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, Princeton University, among others. This is a compilation of many of the images that are in Shapono. The creation of this book, the award the book received, and its placement in major collections around the world had on the community many empowering effects and began a whole series of decolonizing actions, such as, and most significantly, that the leader of the project actively sought to legally change his identity card name from Juan Bosco, a name that was given to him by the Catholic missions, to his Yanomami name, Sheronawe Hakihi'iwe. Also, to change the name of their community from Platanal, which means place where banana trees grow, to Mahekototeri. The process of making books and paper in the Amazon was one of trial and error. And after many trials and many errors, as well as consultations with experts in handmade books and papers such as Mina Takahashi from the Udone Paper Mill in New York, Melissa Potter from the Center for Book and Paper Arts, Columbia College, Chicago, Paul Wong, David Reina, Mark Lander, and Alvaro Bastidas in Venezuela, the community established self-sustaining fine quality paper and bookmaking capabilities without creating new dependencies on outside materials, resources, or people. In 2008, in collaboration with Venezuelan scholars and artists such as Alvaro Bastidas and the community, we began to further explore fibers, natural dyes and pigments, as well as book structures, because Alvaro Bastidas brought a specific kind of knowledge, and that was really very good for developing further the concerns and the interests of the project. So here we see Koromoto and Eunice, who you saw earlier, showing us the books, showing us larger sheets of paper, and also this new combination of fibers that was developed and tested during that time. And you can see it's a nice smooth paper, it's really beautiful, and it has a very nice sound. And the earlier image, you could see some of the testing of the colors and extraction of things that we were working and testing. Here we have Sheronawe sewing, learning different techniques for sewing and binding design, and the book Iwariwe was created. It tells the history of how the Yanomami first obtained fire, and it was created with the participation also of the whole community. As in Shapono, the shaman recounted the story that was transcribed onto paper and illustrated by people of all ages and genders in the community. The design of the book echoes the circular construction of their traditional circular dwelling, a shapono. And this, I must mention, is a single copy book and is today in the IDEA also Institute. So because of, it's important to, it is important to note that the lifespan of these important documents is threatened by the continuing conditions of the Amazon's climate. Another reason why it was agreed by the community to create collaborations for the books to serve the community properly by placing these valuable cultural testimonies and documents in libraries that can house, share, and conserve them. In 2010 and 2011, by invitation of the artist and professor Melissa Potter from the Center for Book and Paper at Columbia College, Chicago, and Steve Woodall, who at the time was the director, and Cliff Meadow, who was faculty director of the MFA program at Columbia College, Chicago, Sheronawe Hakihi'iwe and I were invited on an artist residency. And for the first time, Sheronawe had access to a professional wet studio of this caliber. And together with Professor Potter and her master students, they assisted Sheronawe in the creation of a series of large pulp painting works that you can see here. This experience, along with the guidance and support from the artist Luis Romero from Venezuela, Sheronawe's work was awarded the first prize in the first Indigenous Arts Biennial, with works created during his residency at the Center for Books and Paper at Columbia College, Chicago. And today, Sheronawe's work has received numerous exhibitions and awards and inclusions in major collections such as el Banco Mercantil de Venezuela, la colección Patricia Phelps de Cisneros, the British Museum, among others. It is my belief that by recognizing and supporting the reciprocal benefits of these collaborative projects, we further extend our understanding and respect for each other. Gracias.
Lauda, thank you so much. Those were two just wonderful and inspiring talks, and I hope you all feel the same way I do about them. We are joined back with Nigel Poor from yesterday, and Philip Zimmerman. And Phil, you're here, right? And Andre Bradley is now online. And so if everybody, you can unmute yourselves. Andre, go ahead and unmute yourself. And I hope that at least some of you were with us yesterday for the presentations, to see all the presentations. And I've been really looking forward to opening up the discussion with the others today. So our great helper, Maria Egoavia, is going to forward any questions you have to us. And we don't have any yet, but please, please chime in here. I have a few, and the presenters may have a few questions for one another. I want to start with Lauda, and just that presentation, as I said before, brought back so many memories, and I know, Cliff, you have a lot of memories from that time with Lauda and Sharonawi Hakihiwe and Alvaro Gonzalez Bastidas and Maria Gersi and the people from the IDEA Institute in Caracas. And IDEA is an acronym for Instituto de Estudios Avanzados, Institute for Advanced Study, right? Lauda, did I have that right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, and I know we were able to send a group of our students with Melissa Potter down to Caracas after, really shortly after Cheryl visited us. I'm trying to remember, I think he might have visited us twice, or just maybe it was just once. I can't. Do you remember, Cliff? Twice?
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 I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. I have to tell a really brief story, and Cliff will remember this. We took Cheryl and Maria Elena out to dinner one night, and Maria acted as our interpreter in Spanish, and we asked Cheryl, Cliff asked Cheryl if there were any kind of exotic foods that they eat down there that we don't know of here. And Cheryl said, well, one thing is we have these big black spiders that we eat. And if you eat those, and if you're having bad dreams, you know, this is a remedy for that. And Cliff said, oh my God. And, you know, I thought, well, eating a big black spider would actually give me bad dreams. And but Cliff asked if what do they taste like? You know, I thought he might say they taste like chicken. He thought for a minute and he said, well, they taste kind of like caterpillars. And it was just such an amazing, and this is what we're talking about, this whole symposium, bridges to other cultures and other people. And the presence of Cheryl in Chicago at that time was just such a great learning experience for all of us. We learned so much from him, and Lauda, your concept of a reciprocal change of you know, knowledge is so essential to that project. And so anyway, it's not a question.
Kind of a rambling anecdote.
It's kind of a rambling, yes, you know, anecdote. So
Laura, how are Shero and those people doing now? It seems like conditions are very difficult there.
Yes, they have been. Sheronawe was, he's in Caracas right now and has been having these, well, he just arrived recently into Caracas to work. And so when it's so difficult to get gasoline, to transport, to get in and out, the political situation is making more difficult for traveling within even the territory, which is restricted territory to outsiders only if you have a permit or you live there. And so he, when he goes out, he stays away several months and then goes back. So he's in Caracas with his whole family, his wife, children, everyone. And he's also planning to set up a papermaking studio in Puerto Ayacucho, which is the state capital of Amazon. So it'll be easier for him to get from the high Orinoco territory to Puerto Ayacucho, but it's still not easy, but it will be much easier. So he will have a papermaking facility. Hopefully soon, maybe all of you can come and collaborate on a project with him. I know he's looking for guidance and ideas and experienced creators.
I would go in a minute. I was so sorry I couldn't go with the group to Caracas.
Well, if you're ready, there's things to do.
So one question has come in over the transom from my wife, actually, just now. She was struck by how in both presentations today, there was a real sense of the community being involved in art making. That it was an integral part of their society. And in your experience, otherwise, today in our culture, what's missing? How can this experience inspire us to create stronger communities and a more integrated experience of art? And it's a big question today.
I would maybe reject that idea. A lot of our students work collectively. I think that collaborative work is much more common than it was 15 or 20 years ago. And the students work at the people I work with, at least, love to work collectively.
Nigel, if you're here, yesterday you talked about your experience working, if anybody didn't tune in, who's tuning in now, your experience working with the two teaching experiences you have, which were working with the incarcerated guys in San Quentin, as opposed to your students at Sacramento State. The kind of attitude toward their art making, and their response to art was quite different. You want to say a little something, expound a little bit more on that for us?
You mean different from student work, or
a little bit, yeah. If I read you right yesterday.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I tried to do was to express very clearly that photography offers anyone who looks at it the opportunity to find themselves within the image. And I think when people realize that, they see a power in their own ability to create. And that's what gets really exciting. And I think when you're in a situation where you're not given much autonomy, or you're not told that what you have to think matters, when you're in prison, basically, being told it does matter is just allows access to a kind of imagination that's really potent. And that's what I noticed with the guys inside. And then one of the things I would like to say is, I was a teacher at some point when I was working on that archive project, but it was really important when we moved over to the podcast project, which is the storytelling project, that I wasn't a teacher, that we were professional collaborators. And so that really changed, that changed the dynamics in some ways. And that to me was a little bit more interesting because we were learning together how to do something as opposed to me going in with a, an expertise to share.
Great. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Andre, are you thinking in book form now? The work you're doing now, what kind of form is that going to take for you?
Well, usually things take the form of images and text in a slide format. And I'm not thinking in book form, but I could be. And I'm not a designer, so I haven't had much experience with making books by hand myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just now getting acquainted with different binding styles and processes of sequencing. So I'm looking for collaborators too.
It seems like it'd be very easy for you to find people who want to work with you. Have you tried doing any print-on-demand books just to get some ideas roughed out?
Yeah, I've made a few things just with the printer and 8.5 by 11 paper and a stapler. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Cool. Well, let me know if you're looking for a collaborator.
Awesome, will do.
Well, one of the really great experiences of doing these symposiums has just been to introduce the artists to one another, through this forum. And some great connections and collaborations actually have been made over the past 5 years here. So you all get busy, okay?
Lauda, I have a question. Have you taught paper making with other communities outside of the United States besides the one you shared today?
Yes. Thank you, Andre. Yes, I have. I don't consider myself a master paper maker like the wonderful people who have taught me. But I have taught and replicated the paper, the same approach, right? Look around, what's going on? Let's translate this, test this, and see how we can make books with what you have here. So it's in several communities in Venezuela, because people would find out, other of the communities would find out and say, hey, everybody's communicating on the radio. We want to learn too. So I would go, but also what was really wonderful was the project leaders could go to other communities and teach, because I really don't want it to depend on me. But as to other countries as well, in Mexico, we have done it in Chiapas, that's where my grandmother's from, and in Oaxaca, also in Trinidad and Tobago. I was invited on a residency and started it there with I hadn't planned to do that. And it ended up that the arts program had been cut from the school, and it's in the north of the island. And it was incredible because just the kids had such a sensibility. It was done in the school to natural materials. And just so much energy. We're experimenting and testing much more than way 10 steps ahead of me. And so that was really incredible. And so that community is also, it's called Grand Riviera, is connected to environmental protection. They take care of and have been responsible for repopulating the leatherback turtle in the island. So yeah, I have a long answer. Sorry.
Oh, that's good. No, thank you. That's great.
So, and they've also taught, like the rural area, they would go to the city and teach at some of the elite schools paper making, and started to replicate the project in other places. So that was really also really beautiful to see. They've continued.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I'm actually remembering having in sixth grade, a long time ago for me, taking or someone visiting our art class in sixth grade and doing a paper making workshop with us. So just remembering that.
Ah, great.
Really cool.
Well, we have to start those again.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Your images would be also really beautiful on handmade paper.
Thank you. Awesome.
Yeah. So I look forward to seeing that, your work, because really, thank you.
So, I have a question for Phil. We spent a lot of time together yesterday, actually, and Andre and Phil and I did. And we talked a lot about photography. We talked a lot about processes, but Phil, I can't remember. I forgot to ask you about what your current projects are. You have such a productive, work life, and I'm always so impressed with your process. What have you got? If you want to talk about anything you're working on now.
Well, I spent several months researching those camouflage cell phone towers.
Mm-hmm.
I did a ton of research and even did some recordings with the guy who first was a project manager on the first ones. And I'm particularly interested in the ones that are like saguaro cactuses, because they're of course of our place. But I kind of doing that little thing with the quarantine public library. And I feel kind of funny because my thing was so not about community, except for that quarantine public library piece, which I do think is more about how everyone was creating work during the pandemic. But anyway, that little book that I did for them for the QPL, it just like, okay, that's enough. I don't need to do any more. So I wouldn't say I wasted about 2 or 3 months taking photographs and doing the research, but I don't think I have much more energy to go back to that. I had started a new book that was about the Christian. It's rather it's very political. It's about separation of church and state and how the Christian right is trying to take over the country. Very light subject. But it was using news photographs, and then I got that warning from Reuters about using one of their photographs without payment, and I just decided maybe I need to do something else or do it differently, because I don't want to take a chance on violating, what do you call it, just the rights, and they're very expensive to buy the rights for. This is one of the reasons I mentioned it yesterday. There's so many artists who are not really aware of what trouble they can get in by using found imagery that doesn't fall within the very gray bounds of fair use, which means you have to make serious alterations before it can really be called fair use. And because I got this warning notice to pay this very high penalty for using a Reuters photograph in 2010, kind of put a chill into what I was working on. And so now I'm either I'm really right now thinking about what I should do next, and putting aside this work that I had already started on that had a close-up of a picture of Trump holding up the Bible, the famous one in the Lafayette Park. There's just a million photographs like that that are just, horrendous. So it's a combination of that, the rights problem, and the fact that I really don't want to think even about Trump anymore. But I also feel very nervous about the future here and feel like I need to do something to protest. because we're just in such danger in 2022 and 2024. Anyway, long answer. I can't give you a very specific project I'm working on right now.
Yeah, well, we're waiting. In fact, everybody here has such a broad fields of interest and work. And I mean, for example, Nigel, we didn't really talk, it wasn't the topic, but you weren't able to mention a lot of your own fine artwork that you've done over the years, which I know is on your website. And I enjoin everyone to please look at all of these people's websites because there's so much material out there for you, including Dana, who couldn't be with us today, but his introductions to poetry, if you go to danajoy.com, if you're interested in poetry, and follow his short films and lectures, they're just wonderful. But Nigel, go, yeah.
I wanted to mention something about Nigel's lecture too. I mentioned to her afterwards, sort of off on the edge of the stage, that I had heard her Fresh Air broadcast and loved it. And I hadn't put two and two together there. And she didn't mention it during her talk, but you can all go back and listen to it. It's fabulous.
Oh, thank you.
I don't think I know anyone else who's ever been on Fresh Air. It's so cool.
I have to tell you, it was like a lifelong dream for me. I was like, someday, if only I could get to talk with Terry Gross. It was as amazing as you could imagine. She's fantastic. She makes you feel so comfortable. And it was funny because Erlon didn't really know who she was. And I kept trying to explain it. And he's like, oh, she's your Oprah. That's how I feel about Oprah. I was like, exactly. She's my Oprah.
It's really funny.
No, that's a great comparison, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I urge anybody who hasn't seen that to go to Fresh Air's site and look it up, because.
And you get to hear a lot more from Erlon there, which is great. You get more of his backstory. So it's a really good reason.
The one excerpt that she played from Ear Hustle on that, where that guy you were raising a very difficult question. I won't get into it, but I just have to say, I was so impressed with the way you handled that.
Thank
you are kind of like, to me, your own version of Terry Gross. You make people feel, you draw people out so well. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But Nigel, your own work is so interesting, and nigelpoor.com, is that the website?
Yeah, that's still there. It hasn't changed in a long time because I just don't get to it anymore.
Okay. And Andre, you have a website, I think, and I don't, we linked on the museum site to some of the presenters' things that you could find online, but for some reason they didn't have one for you.
Yeah, mine should be andrebradley.com.
Okay, and then the woman who worked on design with you for the archives has a really good kind of pictures of the book and stuff.
Yeah, Alana Schlenker. I think her website is alanaschlenker.com.
Yeah, good. Well,
the pictures, the photographs she has of the book are really, really great.
Do you have it on your screen right now? Can you copy a link of that to us?
Yep.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I can send it to everybody too.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just offline. I'll send it. But Cliff, we haven't asked you any tough questions, but
Don't.
I'll try to think of one. I'm glad you explained the misregistration on Heart, the last book you talked about, because I remember the first time I looked at that, I thought, wait a minute, Cliff's a better printer than that, and the whole idea there was to, if you could just at least briefly talk about that again, how you wanted to, the place you wanted to put the reader in or the viewer, and with that, what the strategy was there.
Well, it's something about withholding,
Uh-huh.
and also trying to play with being tantalizing and withholding at the same time. So the thing I've wrestled with all this travel and the exotic and Orientalism and all this stuff is how do you have these experiences that feel authentic for you, but then don't become just more fodder for this, you know, it's kind of colonializing really. So the idea was, and I'm troubled by photography anyway, because it always does this, right? Photography tries to create a window and you think you're really seeing something real, or it pretends to have some veracity, but it doesn't. You know, photography is always a lie. But we play with this game with photography that it's trying to tell us something about the world. So the way color images are reproduced in this cyan, magenta, yellow, black language looks very transparent to us, just like these RGB pixels I'm staring at you in right now. We pretend like it's something real, it really means something, but it doesn't. It's as full of artifacts and lies and misinformation about the way things look. The way we see is so different than photography. So by breaking down those images so that they didn't really register anymore, I wanted to kind of show you something, but also screw it up so that you wouldn't believe that it was real. So the different, each of those printers, right, the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black printers were a different size, and they would only actually register in one spot. So I was sort of interested in that idea of making you look only at one thing, and I would pick the thing you got to look at. And then it was supposed to be kind of frustrating, but also beautiful.
Yeah.
Can I share a quote that Cliff just made me think of, that I think a lot about with photography, which is, and it's attributed to Godard, but I'm not really sure he ever said it, so don't hold me to that. But it is, you can start with fact or fiction, but inevitably one will recall the other.
Huh.
And I think it's so perfect for, you know, the work that most of us do.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
When I was in art school, there was an idea of docu-art, that there was a kind of practice in art that that had a more fraught relationship with fact telling, right? So you know, I'm trying to think of who was probably the best example of it. There are lots of artists from the 80s who used photography in this kind of problematic way.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Andre, you're using photography in a really different way, because it doesn't seem to be making a truth claim to me, that it has some other claim going on in those photographs about a kind of expressiveness without being, I don't know what to call it, you know, photo secession. I mean, it's really something else going on there. And that's interesting to me, how it walks that line between a kind of snapshot language and something feeling very serious at the same time. And the snapshot's a really cool thing to think about in photography anyway, right? And now that everybody is like a professional photographer, it's really interesting to think about what photographs mean now.
Yeah.
You know, we could go on for hours here, and I'm getting the high sign that we need to wrap it up. But any one of you is worth spending a lot of time with, and many of you I have spent long conversations with. So I hope that all of our viewers here can look up these artists and see more of their work.
Yeah,
Lauda, we didn't even get to talk about the Moko Jumbi's project, which is amazing.
For example,
Phil's website will lead you through dozens of incredible books. Andre has got so much yet to come, and so many collaborations to do, and we're going to be following Andre's work for a long time to come. I wish I could buy stock in you, Andre.
Start buying his books, man, before you can't afford them.
Yeah. And if any of you haven't heard Ear Hustle, all I can say is, man, you're really missing something. You got to check it out. And the new book is a great read. This is an audio project, but the Ear Hustle book, I don't have it here to hold up right now, but it really, go buy one.
Thank you.
And thank you all. Cliff has got a great kind of new website that shows all his books too. So
it's junk.
We're going to sign off, and I will be in touch with all of you. And this will be on YouTube, so we can refer people to this program and yesterday's program. It'll be up there for a good long while. So you know, spread the word, and
cool.
And we
Thank
are
you,
gonna-
Steve. And
Yeah.
thank
Yeah,
all of
thank you,
y'all
Steve.
for such a
Yeah.
cool set of presentations. That was
Yeah.
awesome.
Thanks to
Yeah.
everybody. And thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you to Maria, Chris, Danny, everybody who helped us with this project. It's been great. And of course, I have thanked our funders, but they have been amazing. None of this happens without this support. And
Yes.
thank you, the Logan family.
Yes, big thanks, Logans.
Thanks,
Hey.
everyone. Take care.
We're-
Bye.
we're-
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
y'all.
Bye. Yes, hearts all
Stay in
around.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.